So I think we're streaming again to Richmond. Let's make sure Richmond is receiving us. So we've gone through, I'm going to assume no news is good news. So, yep, there we go. So we've gone through HTML and CSS, and we haven't touched on JavaScript. For those of you just walking back in, and Winston-Salem, you haven't missed anything. I just verified that Richmond is on the line. So let's talk about JavaScript, which is the first quote-unquote real language that we've learned. What's different between HTML and CSS versus JavaScript? Who can help me out there? Kirsty.
HTML and CSS are presentation and styling, and JavaScript starts to get more into coding.
Okay, and the answer is absolutely correct. HTML and CSS are more for presentation, and JavaScript is a full coding language. So you can do things in JavaScript, and contrary to what Dave was saying about a big boy language, about C#, people write seriously large, complicated systems in JavaScript these days. I don't necessarily endorse that, but Node.js is very suitable for very large systems. Node.js we'll talk about in a day or two, but that's what you can do to write JavaScript outside of the browser. So all the JavaScript we've seen so far work inside of Chrome or Safari or Internet Explorer, and that's kind of its container. It interprets that JavaScript and it runs it, and you do things to the page. By the way, you'll probably see this out there in the internet if you've done some tutorials. DOM, D-O-M. What does that stand for? Developers lug their acronyms. Document Object Model. Don't be afraid of it. All that means is, you know all the elements and stuff in your page? It's the DOM. So when you manipulate the DOM, you know, if you're going to be a hyper nerd and talk with other people about this stuff, I manipulated the DOM and I removed elements and I rearranged the page. It's okay. All they're talking about is they deleted an HTML element on the page. Okay? So they like to say things really complicated, I guess, to make themselves sound smart. DOM, just a techno speak for Document Object Model, meaning HTML elements. You already know how to do that. Okay? So let's talk about Node.js can be used for very powerful things. We're not going to talk about Node.js today. I just want to let you know that JavaScript is a very, very powerful language, and it is outside of just the container of the browser and the DOM. You can use JavaScript for writing pretty much any system these days. We'll talk about exactly what that is later on. But let's talk about JavaScript mechanics today. So that's the first language that has an if statement in it. And if statements and functions are bread and butter to developers. No matter what language you write, they've got to have an if statement or the equivalent. They've got to have some sort of way to have a function. They've got to have variables. Those are the three core tenets. Most of them, you know, more than 90% of them that I've ever seen have arrays. So you've seen we've gone at a blistering pace. We've gone through an entire language in hours. And that's, I'm not talking HTML, CSS, I'm talking about JavaScript. We've touched the very tip of the iceberg. But we've shown you the whole anatomy of the iceberg. You just don't realize it yet. The reason you felt a little bit overwhelmed and disconcerted, and more than a couple people came by and said, should I feel like I'm lost? And the answer is yes. I didn't even hesitate. Because we've thrown so much at you, and that was kind of the point. But now, what we're doing is, let's go revisit what we taught you, and let me explain why we did it that way. We taught you variables, functions, we taught you if statements, we taught you how to read code, we taught you when code runs, and you're going to see it over and over. So let's go and let's reuse our circle example. Right now, this page has nothing in it except HTML and CSS. And one of the nice things about these text editors that you can't do in Notepad is you see these little collapsible sections? You can do that, and you can't do that in Notepad. So I can focus on showing you just what I want. And as we learned, I can put the script tag anywhere I want. So just so I can collapse that head and give you a script tag, do you have to write type is equal to text/JavaScript? Absolutely not. You used to have to, and I'm kind of showing my age. It used to be that browsers, before JavaScript kind of took over the world, there used to be other acceptable scripting languages that, we'll see who wins out. JavaScript won out a long time ago. But before, you used to be able to say something like VB script. I don't think even Internet Explorer supports VB script anymore. So, nope. So you could actually, and Harper's like, you could do that? Yeah, you could write VB script in the browser 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Not anymore, I doubt. I don't think so. So that's all you have to do to say, hold on, browser, here's some JavaScript. JavaScript is a full language, but the only way we've seen how to run it is inside the browser. We're using the browser to be able to interpret our JavaScript and do some interesting things. So let's write some very basic JavaScript. I want to create a variable, and let's do something very, very simple. I want to have a little JavaScript function that when we click a button, we're going to read the value from two text boxes, add those, we're going to take those strings, convert it to a number, and add them together and show the result on the screen, either through an alert or replacing the HTML in a div. And we're going to do it the hard way, just to show you that all of this is relevant, and then we're going to do it the easier way with jQuery. So the hard way, you don't have this document-ready craziness that I showed you yesterday that we're going to get back to. Let's go and write our HTML to begin with. So I'm going to comment out our red and blue circle because it's not going to have anything to do with our example. For clarity, I'm just going to delete it because I've already given that to you over in Slack. So we've got an empty body again. Let's go ahead and, I'm being silly about this. I don't have to mangle my page. I've got a page 2 just sitting here. Okay? Okay, so all I did is I copied and pasted the HTML structure, and I'm going to go ahead and add a script tag. So I'm redoing what I just did a minute ago. Some of you may have noticed that sometimes I use double quotes, sometimes I use single quotes. Is one better than the other? No. Same thing. Sometimes it's important to be able to concatenate, and you have to have, I remember, I think I was speaking with Emma yesterday, and she had a problem where she had embedded a little bit of code inside of a string. And Kathy and I had a discussion about this a long time in Visual Basic, where you have to build a string inside of another string, so you have to be careful about the delimiters, because it's easier to show you. It's single and double quotes. It helps out in JavaScript to be able to do either one. For now, let's get back to our example. So we're going to have two text boxes and a button. Two text boxes and a button so that we can have number 1, number 2, and click the button and add them together. Very basic math stuff. We need to remember our HTML. What's the HTML for a text box? Input. Is that all? And to be able to talk to it later, we probably want to give it some sort of tag or something, attribute. What do you all want to do? Let's give it an ID. Let's call it number 1. Okay? You know, if we did that, let's go ahead and save that, and you'll see that that's not going to be very useful. As is. So page 2, I think is what I called it. Yeah. So right now, a user is confronted with that screen is like, what a horrible developer. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. There's not even a button here. So let's give them a little help. Let's ask them for what we want. How do we put a little gray background text in that text box at least? Placeholder. Okay? Now, don't get freaked out, Richmond. I'm going to copy and paste this. And I'm going to do it fast. Okay? Magically, we got 2 text boxes. And speed things up to get to the good parts. Let me type. Y'all help me out. I want a button now. How do I do a button? Yeah. Input type is equal to button. They both work. They're like 3 different ways to write a button. So button, yeah, we want an ID or a class or something. What do we want to call this? This is going to be the button they click on to actually add the numbers. Doesn't matter really. This is where you get to be creative as a developer. So with a button, the way you specify the text is, I believe, because I usually use the input type equal to text with a value. You just put it in here. So, you know, sometimes it's nice to give your users, well, let's see what this looks like. Let's go over here and refresh. Wow, that's starting to come together. It's nice to sometimes, for those users that need a little extra help, it's nice to get them tooltips. And fortunately, the browser knows how to do that almost automatically. Has anybody found, through your Googling or through previous experience, about how you can put a tooltip on almost any elements in HTML? There's an attribute.
How you can do what?
Put a tooltip. A tooltip like when you hover over something, it shows you that. That's a tooltip. You would think it would be tooltip, but it's not. It's anybody else know, or I'll just give it to you. Title. Somebody said title. Yes. If you say title on almost any element, whatever description text you put in here will be in the tooltip. Okay. I'm making it purposely long so that you can see what it looks like. I'm going to go over here with my mouse, refresh, and there it is. So I can hover and it'll show it. Now that's really small text and it's not going to help out a whole lot of people, but at least it's there. There are better ways, and we're going to learn a little bit about something called Bootstrap, and they're nice, very styled tooltips, but at least this is better than nothing. So, right now, if I click this button, what happens?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing, because we didn't tell it to do anything. You know, it's a dead page. So, I'm going to, sorry. It's, they took my mouse away because this is kind of an inclined thing, so I'm going to use my mouse pad. Okay, so.
I think there is one that's plugged into his laptop.
That's all right. You're trying to slow me down, right? So, doing a good job. So, JavaScript, let's add some JavaScript. JavaScript is for enabling some interactivity with the page. So when we click on this button, and this is where you have to start thinking about event-driven programming. You got to think about what you want to do before you start writing code. And we kind of gloss over that because that's kind of inferred. It's implicit. But you have to know what you're going to do before you start writing it. Because if you start writing code and you don't know what you're going to do, you're going to get halfway through and have to rewrite it all. You're going to have to do a lot of rework. So I kind of gloss over that because I've done this thousands of times. But let's stop and think through this. How do I know what I want to do at this point? Well, logically, I've got 2 text boxes and I've got a button on the page. I did that because I know some HTML. What do I want to have happen and when? When I have them click on the button is when I want them to actually add whatever they have in the text box 1 and whatever they have in text box 2. And I've got to have a place to put that afterwards. So I've got to have like an alert, like a little pop-up box, or I'm going to have to put it into a div or another text box or something else. Just to mix it up, let's put another text box on the screen, and let's make that text box so they can't change it, so they know it's kind of just for output. We'll learn a little bit more about some HTML and some CSS in doing that. So we've got 2 inputs, and just to make it nice and pretty, I'm going to put a plus sign in between them so it's obvious what's going on. And I'm going to put another text box here. And rather than bore you by typing it out, I'm just going to copy and paste. And I'm going to call this one a result. I don't need a placeholder because this is just going to be where we stash whatever the 2-number result is. And we could do an equal sign here if we want. So right now, we still haven't added any interactivity, but now there's a big difference from where we were a minute ago. We know where we're going. We have a plan, and that matters a lot. So let's go back over here to our browser. Let's refresh. And it kind of looks okay. The user can kind of see what's going together now. So they want me to put a number in here and a number in there, and they want to click this button, and then ideally the result will come out here, right? We can make this prettier, but I'm not going to because you all have all the CSS tools at your disposal. We've taught you that, how to make it as pretty as you want. You've got padding, margin, width, height. You can change the backgrounds. You can change the borders. You know all that stuff. Style these text boxes to death if you want. Let's focus on the JavaScript. So going back over here, let's go to the scary JavaScript stuff, which isn't so scary. So, bless you. We don't have jQuery, so we have to do it the old school way. The old school way is when they click on a button, we're going to run some code. So the way you do that is there's an attribute on the button that you can say onClick equals, and that's going to give us, that's how the browser knows, I want you to do this when they click this button. What are we going to do? Let's run a little bit of code. And how do we stash a little bit of code, not just in this attribute, but let's put it up here in our head. How do we do that? So we can call it, so we can talk about it. We need a function. A function is nothing more than a little bundle of code that has a name. So we're going to go up here and we're going to create a little bundle of code that does whatever it is we want to do here and give us back what we want out of it. So what are we trying to do here? Keep your mind in the plan. We're trying to add 2 numbers. So how do you create a function? Function. Let's name it add 2 numbers. Now, in order to add 2 numbers, and this is where the logic comes in. This is when you're in grade school or when you're thinking about your major in high school or college, and they say, I'm thinking about computer science. And they say, oh, you got to be a good math person to be able to do that. Are you strong in STEM? Otherwise, you shouldn't even try it. What they meant was, oh, can you put basic logic together? It's not about math at all. That's a myth. It's about, can you think things logically through so that I need to get to that goal? What are the discrete steps I need to take to get there? It's logic. It's common sense. It's not math. So I'm trying to walk you through the steps on how you build a UI with JavaScript. And that's, where are we? We have a plan. In order to add 2 numbers together, you've got to grab 2 numbers from the user interface, take 2 text boxes. You got to have a button so that I know when the user wants me to do the addition. When they click the button, okay, how does it get from here to there? It's step by step. You got to have a little on click. Well, I have nowhere to go yet. So let's go write a little function that does the work so that I can get that named little piece of code called a function and put it down here. So I'm going to add 2 numbers. Next logical problem. To add 2 numbers, I need to have the 2 numbers. Can I pass it in? Well, I could, but in this case, it's going to be easier if I just look at the page. So I've got a function there. It does nothing right now. Just as a sidestep, just to make sure that we're on the right track, sometimes as you're learning especially, it's good, thanks editor, it's good to, verify where are you. So console.log is like, got here. Just to say, is it working? Is the browser mad at me? Did I do something wrong? So at this point, if I were to save the page and click the button, would it do anything? No. What have I forgotten to do? Logic, step by step. What did I miss? I didn't call the function. I've got a function, but I didn't call that function anywhere. This is very important. And this is actually flashing forward to this afternoon jQuery. A function definition doesn't execute unless you call it. So all I'm doing here is I'm saying, here's a little bundle of code, but it's not going to run automatically. It never runs if I don't call it. It's just sitting there for decoration purposes unless you call that function. So right now, if I forgot to say add two numbers down here in the onClick event, it's never going to run. That's what the math part of coding is all about. It's step-by-step logic. Why is it not working? Think like a computer. Okay? The computer's not very smart. You got to take it step by step. Hold it by hands like here. This is what I want you to do. So let's jump over here and let's click the button. I save that. Okay, so we got two numbers. It doesn't really matter what I enter here because we haven't actually done the adding yet. But if I click the button, I've got the console log coming out. We're on the right track. So sometimes when you're first learning especially, or even when you're doing something very complicated, it's helpful to stop halfway or a third of the way. It's like, am I on the right track or did I make a mistake already? This is a vote of confidence. You can go back. It's like, let's dive back into it and let's finish this up. So we know at this point we have the user interface done. We have an onClick event that's going to call this function. And we know this works because we just saw it come out. Now, all we need to do is we're going to get the values in text box 1 and text box 2, convert them to numbers because by default, anything typed into a text box is what? A string. It's text. In text, what happens if you do a plus sign with two pieces of text? Concatenates it. Y'all have been listening. So it would take text 1, text 2, and smush them together because they're strings. What we have to do to add things together is we got to convert those to numbers and integers in this case. We'll keep it simple. So I need two variables. One variable that captures the first text box value, the second that captures the second. Don't really need them, but let's do it longhand. So n1 is equal to, now we got to do the painful long-handed way because we're taking a step back from jQuery. Then we're going to see this in jQuery. So get element by ID, and we're going to talk about, we called it number-1 dot value. Okay? Does anybody know? I'm going to put it in a comment over here. How would you do that in jQuery? It's like that. So it's really a matter of, would you rather type that? Would you rather type that long thing and have to look at it every time? That's all we're doing with jQuery. So I copied and pasted. We have two variables. That will work to get the text, but I just said if we concatenate those two numbers, actually let's do that. Let's do it wrong first, and then we'll fix it. So we've got those two things. And we need to take those two things and we want the result to go in something else. What did we call our text box where we want to put the result? It's result. Where do I see that? It's right there. And we're setting the value in this case. And I hope this works because I haven't, like I said yesterday, I haven't written this JavaScript in like 10 years. So we're going to say n1 plus n2. You'd think that would be it. I just want to add two numbers together, right? By the way, in jQuery, how would you say this?
$sign.
Hash sign for ID. Remember CSS? Same thing in jQuery. And we want to set the text box value. How do we do that? The value, except this time we're going to put the value in there. Val, if you don't pass in any parameters, it gives you the value. If you pass it parameters, it's going to set the value. That's how you'd say it. So once again, look at the difference. That long, nasty thing or that pretty concise thing. The biggest difference is really what? The CSS selector. That's the power of jQuery. That's why it's called jQuery, using CSS selectors to query the DOM. Anyway, so save that. When I click the button, is this going to work? What do you think is going to happen?
It's just going to put the two strings together.
It's going to concatenate whatever I put in the first text box with the second one, and it's going to put the result in the result text box, if we did this right. So let's go over here, and let's refresh the page. And we're going to say 55 and 32, and add two numbers, and we get 5532. And that's not the result. But that's exactly what's going on. Why is that the result? Because JavaScript is a loosely typed language, and it infers the type. You're going to soon see in C# a strongly typed language. What does that mean? Right here, I can't tell n1 that I want you to be an integer, a number. It's going to be a string because I'm picking up the string from the text box value because that variable is of type string. So when you set it to a variable, it inherits that data type. If I want to change that data type, you have to actually parse it into an integer. There's a predefined function called parseInt. And what we're going to do is, remember parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, so on? We're going to take this string, pass it to a function. The function's name is parseInt. What do you think that does?
Changes it from a string to an integer.
It changes it from a string to an integer. So the input is string, the output is integer. So when it finishes that and it throws it over into n1, what do we have? What type of data?
Before the parse, it's a string, and now you have an integer.
It's going to have an integer because the result of the parseInt is an integer data type. So let's do the same thing with n2. Well, actually, let's run it like this. What do you think is going to happen? We're going to get an error? It's going to be the same thing. Why is it going to be the same thing?
Because it's an integer and a string.
Because we had an integer and a string. If you add an integer and a string together in JavaScript, JavaScript says, silly developer, you have a string in there, and the string wins. So the string is going to say, well, I'm going to convert the integer to a string for you to help you out, rather than give you an error. So it converted it back to a string. So all of our hard work of doing the parseInt, all for naught, because JavaScript was trying to help us out. Let's go ahead and convert them both to an integer. And now we're cooking with grease. There we go. n1 plus n2. We got two integers. It's going to actually have numbers to add together. Do we have to convert it to a string? You could, but you don't have to. Why? Because to put anything into a text box, it's got to be a string. So JavaScript is going to take the number and it's going to convert it to a string for you. If I was talking like this on day 2, y'all would have left the room. because I'm talking about data types. I'm talking about how the compiler actually works with the code. It was more important at that point for you to understand and look and understand how to read the code. And now we're getting into what is the code actually doing? How does it behave in edge cases? That's where we're going with this. So I'm saving that. Let's go back over here, and this time we're going to have success. Yep. There we go. Now, the user can lie to us. They can do that. As a last thing, let's make sure the users can't do that. And this has nothing to do with JavaScript. How do you make it so the users can't change the value in that text box?
I'm sorry, maybe input.
Yeah, disable.
There are a couple, 3 different ways. I'm trying to think of a CSS way to do this, and I'm sure Harper knows one. There may be somebody in here who knows one, a CSS way. I only know the HTML ways, and one is disabled. Another is read-only. Read-only is kind of a weird thing. It's an HTML attribute, and it takes a value that is kind of optional, that is also the word read-only. Very redundant. But I'm going to save that, go back over here, refresh. Okay, now if I try to, it won't even let me have focus. Disable will do the same thing, except disable will give it like a gray hue. So it's like, you've seen in Windows where things are disabled, it's pretty obvious you can't click the button. That's what that means. So, any questions about foray back into JavaScript? And we're going back through things. We're going to start back into jQuery this afternoon.
I kind of got lost on the part where you made it calculate rather than just estimate. I kind of got lost that step, like how you got to the actual math. How did the computer do the math?
Okay, so the question was, how did you get it to do math instead of the concatenation? I did nothing different. This is the statement, the magical statement that does the addition. It's just plus. The difference is the data types. So the data type of the first variable, n1, and the data type of the second one are very important because of the way JavaScript is going to interpret what you're trying to do. So I converted it to an integer. Int is short for integer, which means a whole number. And it put it in that box. Remember, variables are just boxes. And that box has a label of n1. I've got another variable I'm declaring and doing the same thing with the second text box. And so we've got 2 boxes, both a flavor number, an integer. That flavor of the number, that type of variable, that data type is all important. Because if you didn't convert it to a number, this plus sign right here is going to be interpreted differently by JavaScript. Plus in JavaScript means a couple different things. If you have strings, it means concatenate. If you have numbers, it means do the math.
Oh, okay. So the way you converted it to an integer is parse.
Parse int. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to have some decimal numbers, say you're doing some money calculations, parse float. There's like a dozen JavaScript functions that are just predefined as part of the language like that. Don't worry about memorizing them. When you need them, you can either look them up, Google it, or after a while, you just remember them because there's only like a dozen. It's not a lot. It's like what we memorized this morning about top right, bottom left. There are very few things that you really need to memorize. Don't worry about it. Okay, any other questions? Cool. Let's, I think here in Winston-Salem, we have a talk from our gracious host. But in Richmond, if there are any questions, I will take a look and I'll answer them, or our docents will. Talk with you all at 1.